If the root of your problem is that you don't have a concept of time and you can't identify what 1 minute feels like versus 5 minutes versus 10 minutes, and so you're then not able to properly estimate how much time it will take you to execute a function, then all the tips and tricks for time management of putting the more important things first and so on won't work for you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm excited today to have Joy Gandell talk to us about how the 3-day weekend can help you prioritize what's most important, how to become more productive at what you do. And we're also going to be talking about a concept of looking at whether or not you're time blind. But first, what I want to do is welcome to the show. Joy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Wade, for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Awesome. So a little bit about Joy. She is an ex-human resource self-employed consultant turned critical skills, life skills, parenting, and learning coach, and is the host of the podcast Being with Joy, a quest to crack the parenting code. She's been in the workforce for over 20 years, and for the last 11 years, she's been self-employed so she can prioritize what's most important to her family. And that's one of the main reasons why I think she's such a great match for our show. And she believes, I think she knows actually, but she's probably being a little humble here, that you don't have to work a straight 9-to-5 job to earn a good salary and have more balance in your life. So again, thank you for coming here. What I was wondering if you do is share a little bit about your story, because a lot of the times when people share their story, there's some, not so much huge downturn, but there's this huge, big thing that happened. And from what I got from you is you were already coming from a place of being successful and built on that. And I think sometimes people think, well, if it's successful, I'm just not going to mess with it. And yet you were willing to question assumptions, make changes. So would you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I was an ex-HR person. And when I started my career, I started in the corporate world. And I spent a good 10 years in the corporate world working for other people, as sometimes in a team of HR, other times I was solo. And in my last position, I had young kids. My daughter was just in daycare, and my son was a few years older than that. And my husband's career was taking off because the two of us really had ambitions for our respective careers. And our original agreement was to share parenting 50-50. And my husband's career took off quite rapidly. And the demands where he was working were getting to the point where he wasn't able to do the pickups anymore, because I was going to do the drop-offs, he was going to do the pickups, I was going to make dinner. And so he would call me towards the end of my day and say, I need you to pick up the kids. And then I'd have the kids at home waiting for dinner, and I'd be making dinner, and it was very difficult. And then the recession of 2008, 2009 hit, and I was put down to part-time, but I really didn't want to work part-time yet. And so I picked up an HR client on the side to offset that time. And what I discovered is I really loved working with this small client, small to medium-sized business. And I got more accomplished for them than I did for any other company I had worked for up until then. So I decided, you know what, this is a great way for me to manage my schedule, fulfill my career ambitions, be challenged, at the same time, be more present for my family. And so with that one client, I left the employed by corporations world, and I went off on my own. And I decided that it is totally possible to have a great career while working for myself and being present for my family. And so I did. And it took a few years to gain enough clients. But towards the end of my HR consulting practice, I was making really good money for the amount of time that I was working. I would never have been able to make that salary if I was working in a corporate environment. I had essentially 8 to 9 weeks off, because every time the kids were off, I was off, whether it be vacation, ped days, or they were sick. I controlled the hours that I work during the week. And so I was a hockey ringette mom, and I would take my kids, I'd finish work early, and I'd take my kids to whatever arenas they needed to go to. I had that amazing flexibility, and I was very happy with the salary that I was bringing in as well. At one point, while things were really going well for me in the HR world, my daughter was diagnosed with cancer. And I dropped everything. I told all my clients I'm not going to be working and caring for her at the same time. Two of my biggest clients told me that they were going to wait for me. The others, they had projects that needed to get done and they got those done. I referred them out. And so I attended to my daughter. And then through her cancer treatments, I realized that HR was no longer the career for me, and that I really wanted to dedicate my life to something um, for a higher purpose. And I didn't know what it was. So when her treatments ended, I decided to resume my HR practice. I dropped one of my clients, kept the other one because it was a not for profit, and started thinking perhaps I'll do HR for not for profits. And so as I was building that practice, I realized, yeah, it's just really HR in itself that wasn't for me anymore. And at around that same time, so it was a year after my daughter's treatments ended, my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, 3 learning disabilities, and anxiety. And being the person that I am, I became obsessed with researching everything I could about ADHD and how to help her and her 3 learning disabilities. And what I discovered is that ADHD is really a dysfunction of executive functioning. The symptoms that we see and we associate with ADHD, hyperactivity and lack of attention, these are just symptoms. They're not the cause of ADHD. The cause is impulse control, time blindness, all of these things that really reside within our executive functions. I became fascinated because I saw this as something that translated to all teenagers, not just children with ADHD. And I also saw this as why I was giving time management courses training as an HR person and what I was seeing in adults as an HR person. I saw the end result of what was happening with everybody's executive function. And here I saw an ability to help change that trajectory. And so I learned everything I could about executive functioning. I became a learning coach first because it was the fastest way for me to get a business up and running. So I know the science behind learning and I teach that to students, which incorporate a ton of executive functioning skills. And then I became an executive function life coach. I am now certified by the International Coaching Federation, and I adore my new career. And for the students and the kids with ADHD or executive function challenges that I cannot help, I help their parents and I help them parent their children. So that's what I do. And because of what happened with my daughter's treatment, it's reinforced to me even more why working a 4-day week, a reduced schedule is so important. We are on this planet for a certain amount of time, and we need to work to make money so that we can live. This is an undeniable fact, but we need to also do the living part. And I think that gets forgotten. We do a lot of the working part and we don't do a lot of the living part. And so, whereas the ideal work life balance is going to look like something different for each individual. For me, working for myself and working this reduced time helps me feel fulfilled as a professional, but it also gives me the time to be with my family and to have the connections that I so desire. So that's
That's awesome. And there's so much there. In working with different clients, there's a lot of things I find where they have a hard time figuring out. First of all, just even the first thing that you did of, okay, I'm now either furloughed or I'm part-time or I'm, downsized or whatever the situation is, and looking at how do I focus on what I do best. And I know in my case, 20 years ago, I left a company and I just did consulting, and a lot like you. I didn't leave the corporate world, as you said. I simply got to choose my hours and worked with some of the same people and some of the people that I got to handpick more. And that was sort of like a first step. And then it sounds like you then made that second step of getting better clients and then getting to choose your schedule. Share a little bit, if you don't mind. This is one thing I think that people miss out on is when you're a parent, and I'm going to say this in a way that's going to sound as if what I'm saying is fact. I can't prove this as fact, but it's been my overwhelming experience that kids need a lot of attention. And the more you can afford to give it to them, the better they're going to do. And that's not a knock on anybody who doesn't. It's not a knock on anybody who has put their kids through daycare, whatever it is. I'm blessed that my parents set up a situation, were able to afford a situation where my mother was there. And when we got home from school, she was there, and she was a stay-at-home mom, brilliant woman. There's so many brilliant women that choose that vocation for a time, and they might shift back, or maybe they did something before that. But when you look at, in your case, the decision you made to trade, in essence, quality time, and I know that's a generic word, but in other words, time with your kids during certain ages, and to forego what could have been financial opportunity, perhaps career advancement. What did that feel like? Because a lot of people sometimes would say, "Oh, well, she's just wired a certain way, so she just did that easily." Was it difficult? What was it like? And what advice would you give to somebody who's maybe considering that?
So the choice was very hard. It wasn't easy because I was raised by a mother who worked full time. She was not, if I look at her generation, a lot of her peers didn't have the same career that she did. She was a professional, she was an occupational therapist, and she ran a department. And so as a girl growing up, I had that role model of a full-time working mother, and even though she was full-time working mother, nowadays, if we were to look back, she had amazing working hours. I think she went to work for 8:30 to 4, and because we lived around the corner from the hospital she worked at, she was home no later than 4:30. Those are like ideal hours. People want those hours. And so I felt this tremendous guilt that here I have a master's degree, I have all of this privilege, and I'm taking a step back from the traditional trajectory that we would expect. Um, and even when I was in school, like they were training us, they were saying you're going to become a consultant for a huge consulting firm, or you could eventually become a vice president of human resources. So I had this idea. And when I first met my husband, I said, would it bother you if I became a vice president of HR? Because that was my dream at the time. I wanted to be vice president of HR for a pharmaceutical company. That requires a lot of hours. But when you reframe the situation, and once I had my kids, I didn't expect to. I know this sounds silly because I believe that every single parent adores and loves their children desperately. I didn't expect to be as obsessed with them. And so at the beginning, and I am on my podcast, I talk about how I'm a self-professed ex-helicopter parent. And so I was obsessed with everything about them, and I really wanted to be there for their homework and for their sporting events. I wanted to do it all. And there was that pressure of, I want to be a caregiver. I want to be that great mom who's on the PTA, who's involved with the school, because every single study I had read, and I read all these studies, children do better if you all have family dinners together. So I told my husband, we have to live near your work because you have to come home. You could go back to work after, but you have to come home. We need to have family dinners together. And I curated this life so that my children would have the highest chances of success. And it was super important to me. As a woman in business, it was a struggle to make that decision, as I mentioned. And so I read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. She's the COO of Facebook. I read, and it was this pressure. You have to lean in. You have to lean in. Don't take yourself out of the equation until you absolutely have to. And so I was leaning in. I was doing all that. And then I read a book by Anne Marie Slaughter, and she worked for Hillary Clinton while Hillary was, oh my goodness, I'm Canadian. I forget, and I'm drawing a blank. What was her role? What was Hillary's role when she worked for Obama?
Secretary of
Thank you
State.
very much. Secretary of State. So Anne Marie
Um,
Slaughter worked for Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and she had this amazing opportunity. And 2 years into her role, she took a step back because her children needed her. And she wrote an article in The Atlantic called Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And then she followed that article up with a book. And she spoke to me. Her message resonated with me that we could be super educated, we could be able to have it all, but our children need us. Just like you said, our children need their parents. They not only need our attention, they need our unconditional love, regardless of what's happening. They need us to teach them about emotional literacy. They need us to teach them about how to regulate themselves. They need us to impart all of these lessons to them. And I took that to heart. For me, it really resonated. It doesn't resonate for everybody. And so I figured out a way. I keep using the word curate because I feel like that's what I'm doing. I am curating my own life to achieve my professional ambitions. They might look different than they did when I was 21 years old. I'm in my mid 40s now. But when my daughter was facing life or death, I said, I am here on this earth just for this life. And while she was in treatment, I didn't know how much longer I would have with her. I want to give my children all of me, but I also want to feel satisfied and challenged myself. So I curate. I love the word curate. We have to curate our own lives.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think one of the things that people miss if they've not experienced that is, I'll hear some friends say, well, I grew up without a lot of parenting and therefore that my kids can deal with it. And okay, but then the question is like, but is that what you want? And again, no judgment there. Everybody's doing the best they can. And then on the flip side, when we would start doing things like I gave up playing beach volleyball, one of the things I love most for about 6 years, because I thought that would be the best thing to do as a dad, to just be fully involved. So I've got the helicopter parent degree, or if you had the anonymous meeting, yes, hi, my name is Wade, I'm a helicopter parent. And one of the things that I didn't anticipate was at times blaming my kids for certain things. Or, well, because of them, I don't get to do this. And it wasn't because of them, but I made a choice. But again, I was somewhat at least informed of, I can't say it's the cause and effect, but the common outcomes of when kids don't have as much support. And as I watch our children, my son's about to be 15, or our son's about to be 15, our daughter's 12. And we see some of their friends that the parents just aren't as around as much, and good families, good people, nice people doing their best. And yet you see the ones where right now, in our case, some of them are being raised by the internet. And I'm 49. When my parents were at home, or even if they weren't at home, my friends that were let's say latchkey kids, as the saying was, or however you want to word it, there wasn't, I mean, we couldn't access anything. You know, as a young guy, you couldn't access pornography, even if you tried,
Yeah.
and some of us tried,
Yeah.
but we couldn't. And this was something that there's so much out there that is just the world, and it's not quote unquote the internet's fault, because the internet's just everything that exists. So it's a little bit of everything. And of course, it'd be nice if some things that are really shadier were policed better. But overall, here are these kids at this very curious stage. They're exploring. I know Maria Montessori would talk about the idea that there was, active stages and dormant stages, and then stages that they really wanted to pull everything from you. And then at about 12, they really just wanted to pull everything from the outside world. So no matter how smart you were, they wanted to get information somewhere else because they were just good at that moment with getting information from you. Like I'm good, I'm done. I need now input from the outer world. You and I talked about this. Share a little bit if you don't mind, because this is something that just blew my mind. The idea about how the development, the prefrontal cortex, and I'm gonna say that I said that like as if I know exactly what that means. I just know it's something like here. But what that does at 13 to 15, how that impacts children and just their overall development, and then how it later turns out for people. Again, at bringing it back to it, we're looking to say, how can we be more productive so we can get more results in less time, so we can afford, because you were able to, get the results to afford to work a 3-day week. I mean, should have a 4-day work week or less time or however it is, but in order to curate your schedule. And again, to me, they're all kind of synonymous. Um, how does that start when they're younger, and how does that play out later if a person doesn't address um, being able to make those choices?
Okay. So, first, in being able to make those choices, I also want to, and for me, it's really important to recognize my privilege. Um, I ooze privilege in everything about me, and so I know that not everybody is able or has the same privilege that I do and can curate their lives the way that I have. I am very lucky, first of all, that I have a husband who, during a career transition, supported me financially. I'm very privileged that I have a master's degree, that I'm white. Like, privilege is all around. So I recognize that, and I'm grateful for that. In terms of executive functioning, what I mentioned, so just like you have teenagers, I have teenagers, and I became fascinated by this because I realized why I was seeing the behavior I was seeing in my son, um, who's now going on to 16. So when we hit puberty, and so I'm going to give ages, but it's not set in stone, that age. It's generally when we hit puberty, our brain goes through another period of development. So before we hit puberty, our brains developed greatly in two other times: when we're newborn, and then I believe, if I remember correctly, when we're 3 years old or 5, something like that. But there's another, like, house cleaning that's done, pruning in our brain that's done. And it's when we hit puberty around the ages of 13. And that doesn't end until about 25 or 30 years old. And our brain does its pruning here, just like you mentioned, in the prefrontal cortex, right behind our forehead. And that's where our executive function lie. So what are they? Depending on the expert that you land on, so Dr. Russell Barkley, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Guar, and Dawson, they all have different numbers of executive functions. They will give lists. I like the list by Dr. Guar and Dr. Dawson, and they have a list of about 11. So they list metacognition, our ability to think and reflect on our own behavior and to be aware of what we're doing, time management, organization, planning and prioritization, memory, working memory, emotional regulation, emotional control, or self-regulation, however you want to call it. Time management, I don't know if I mentioned. So there's 11 of them. And all of these get developed during that time. And then you add the hormones to the mix. And the hormones just exacerbate the problem. They make it worse. And it's not a problem. It's a natural phenomenon that our brains are going through. And, you mentioned that as teens, you stop paying attention to the parents and you start paying attention to your friends or the internet and so on. Our children are paying attention to us. They just don't want us to know that they're paying attention to us. So they pretend not to listen, but they are listening. And they are listening to the messages we're sending them. They are paying attention to our behaviors because we are their role models. And so we have to continue talking to them. So during this period of brain development, our executive functions are a little wonky and they're working themselves out. And we can help our teens with their executive functioning by giving them tips and tricks and things that are going to help them. When we get older, around 25, 30, and our executive functions stop developing, that's when they kind of are the way they are. And it doesn't mean that we'll either be really good at executive functioning or really bad. Because there's several of them, we can be stronger in some and less strong in others. And it also doesn't mean that because we've hit 25, 30, that we stop being able to work on them and strengthen them. It just means that if we didn't work on them as teens, by the time we're 25, 30, this is where we're at. But our brains are malleable and we're able to learn and grow no matter how old we are. So as long as we put in and we're accountable and we put in the work to achieve that, we'll be able to work on them. So here I am as an HR person teaching time management to the newly recruited, the new generation, 22-year-olds. No wonder their time management skills aren't so good. But then I would see adults with poor time management skills. So, okay, tips and tricks, that's great. But they still don't work. What happens? What happens to your productivity when you are, as you quoted me, time blind? And I didn't come up with this term. This is a term that is known in the executive functioning world. If the root of your problem is that you don't have a concept of time, and you can't identify what 1 minute feels like versus 5 minutes versus 10 minutes. And so you're then not able to properly estimate how much time it will take you to execute a function. Then all the tips and tricks for time management of putting the more important things first and so on won't work for you. And then if you don't know how to break a task down into smaller steps, how can you be expected to plan or prioritize? So there are certain executive functions that come before productivity, time management, and you have to look at the root causes and ask yourselves, what is actually happening here that I can't execute the way I want to execute? And look for the root causes. And so that's what I'm passionate on, because then you'll be able to achieve your 3-day weekend and you'll be able to achieve more and be more productive in less time. But you have to look at what's actually going on beneath the surface, and it's your executive function skills.
Gotcha. And, that's one of the things that as an entrepreneur growing up in the United States, we have this hero story of the entrepreneur. And it's usually the part of it that usually gets the most pressed or gets, is the most exciting is the entrepreneur who is bold and innovative and they challenge the status quo and they're creative and they're visionary. And they do something that's never been done before. And sometimes that's part of the narrative. And yet there's two other asterisks next to that, at least. Number one is that sometimes that person is supported by somebody who helps them with the implementation and the details. So, Paul Allen to Bill Gates, or Steve Wozniak to Steve Jobs, and I'm sure, the list goes on. But in addition to that, sometimes the business model is, while we're brilliant, if you look at something like Amazon, as opposed to, let's say, Microsoft, as an outsider who doesn't, hasn't worked for either of those companies, but just thinks about, like, okay, Microsoft created software. So it's more of that heroic visionary, like, we did something that's never been done before. And I'm sure somewhere there's a lot of people saying, no, I could have done Amazon. All he's doing is just selling books quicker, and then he sold some more. Like, it almost seems like, oh man, that's so accessible. And yet there's something going on from an execution standpoint that is well above average. That if that wasn't going on, I mean, there's other people out there competing with them that can't do that. How do you maybe contrast, what we normally consider creativity or brilliance versus executive function when it comes to an entrepreneur, and how it affects them and their ability to run their business? Like, what things will somebody run into if they're struggling with their executive function?
Oh, from it really depends. If you're struggling with certain executive functions, it will depend on which executive functions you're struggling with. That will determine what it looks like. So if you're time blind, you might be always late for things. You might not assess how much time it's going to take you to do things. And so you never feel like you're getting on top of things because everything is just taking you so much longer to do them. But above all else, we can, as entrepreneurs, as innovators, I use the word curate. We have all these ideas. It's not only in the execution of the ideas, it's also in the accountability in executing those ideas. Who are you accountable for? Are you accountable to yourself? Are you accountable to someone else? And that's another thing that entrepreneurs struggle with, is the accountability. I have so many ideas. I want to execute everything and execute nothing. Why? Is it because of accountability? Is it because that you can't break down the task into its minute parts and you don't see all the different things that you have to do, and then you're unable to plan and prioritize? So the answer to your question, there is no one answer to your question, because it really will depend on the individual and what they're struggling with in the moment. It's the ability to take a step back, and if you're curious about the executive functions, you could look up Dr. Peg Dawson and Richard Guar's book. They have a series called Smart But Scattered, and they go from children, and I believe they even have Smart But Scattered and Stalled, so it's more for adults. What's happening? Why can't you move forward? And to really then identify which executive function skills are getting in your way in achieving your goals and your ability to have the 3-day weekend, have the 3-day weekend that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that, mentioning, going back to, again, this concept of, you know, creativity being valued so much and execution or implementation not being valued as much, is I also bought into this idea of, okay, well, I'm smarter than the people who work with me or, for me, that help me implement stuff. And for a while I bought into that, and wasn't trying to from an ego standpoint, was actually from a flip side of, oh my gosh, so I've got to figure out everything. It's got to be me that figures it out. And I might be above average, capacity, skill level, whatever it is, in creativity, but I'm well below in execution. And so that was something that took me quite a while to figure out. And if you listen to sort of that first level, the very surface level, I was about to say pop psychology, but pop business psychology, pop entrepreneurial psychology, say, well, you're lazy. You're not willing to do the work. And as you and I both know, there are entrepreneurs working their tails off and not getting to the right place. No different than there's people that study hard and can't pass tests, or any other area of life where, because somebody isn't really addressing the right issue and they're working hard, but they're approaching it in a way that isn't, the optimum way. And that's one of the things I just first suggest people to look at is, if you really are truly when you get into the conversation of trying to balance family and doing work you believe in and making an impact and making an income and creating a life you enjoy, one of those is going to kick your butt in the sense of, well, hey, I'm trying so hard to do this, and I feel like I'm doing my passion, but I'm making no money, or I'm making this money, I can't find time for family, whatever it is. But usually there's something where, we're just not approaching it the correct way, not a morally
Mm.
correct way, but just literally the way that works. And I think that's the thing that excited me so much when you and I were talking in the pre-interview, of just, as somebody who is willing to be a hard worker and yet sometimes labels myself as lazy. And sometimes my wife will say, Wade, you're one of the least lazy people I know. Well, yeah, but I work a 3-day week, or I have a 3-day weekend. So I must be like, no, you work really hard for 4 days. And then on the weekends, you're coaching, you're playing volleyball, you're cleaning around the house. You work hard on the weekends. You just do things that aren't called
Mm.
work. And so you've said, oh, well, not every, that they must be play. One, as you know, Joy, not everything about children is play, raising children. A lot of it's work, and it's very rewarding. But I think that's the part that, to me, when people look at this, is so difficult. And I can tell you, when you explain to me the idea about being time blind and the analogy of the digital clock
Mm.
versus the analog clock, and how a person has a hard time seeing that really resonated with me. Would you mind sharing that? Because I kind of get it, but I know the audience, I think, could definitely benefit from it, because I think it might help people like me who are saying, look, I'm that guy who at times, I've gotten better at it, but at times would be like, I'm always 3 to 5 minutes late. I'm always, and the old message was, well, Wade, if you can be on time, I mean, if you can be 3 to 5 minutes late, well, you can figure out how to be on time. It's like, okay, great. So I'm going to beat myself up, but that still hasn't helped me get the answer. I'm missing something. Share the analogy of the clock, if you don't mind, and how that maybe plays out for people, what that specific thing, the time blindness, looks like for an entrepreneur who's working hard, who's struggling, who's trying to find, what do I do with these competing ideas, and how they make decisions on them.
Okay. So before I do, I want to just touch on something you said before. You talked about, saying I'm lazy, and this term is so used that if I can't achieve everything, I must be lazy, I'm unmotivated, or I'm not smart enough. My personal belief is none of those things are true. We are all smart enough, we are all motivated, and none of us are lazy. It comes down to the executive function skills. Do we know how to execute what we want to execute? And when we don't know, there are times where that just feels so insurmountable that it is easier to avoid it than actually overcome it. And so if you feel that that's the case, don't blame yourself for it. You are smart enough. You are not lazy. You are motivated. Reframe it and ask yourself, now that you know there's such a thing as executive function skills, is it possible that it's an executive functioning issue that I am dealing with? And if so, which one, and how do I tackle that problem? Okay, so the idea of time blind. I made reference to it at the beginning. It's, can you identify, or do you feel what 1 minute represents or 5 minutes represent? In this age of digital, everything's digital. When we look at our phones, when we look at our smartwatches, we are, for the most part, looking at a digital time. We're not looking at a clock. Some people on their smartwatches will put an actual clock, but for the most part, our children in particular see a digital time. That tells them the time right now, this moment, but it doesn't tell us the time in time and space. We don't understand what that really represents. And so when I was little, we didn't really have digital clocks. We had the analog clock. We had a traditional clock, 12, 3, 6, and 9. And then if we were lucky, we filled it, like all the hours were there and all the minutes were also there. And not only did we have a minute hand and an hour hand, we also had the seconds. And we never fully appreciated what looking at a clock like that did for us. We just see it as we could look at it from a physics perspective as a machine, but it is a tool that we use to tell time. The difference between a digital and an analog clock is an analog clock, we can see, if we have a second hand, we could see how long a minute takes. We could literally see it. We don't just feel it, we see the second hand going around the clock. And then we see what 5 minutes represents. And when we see the time, let's say it's 6:30, we can see 6:30 in relation to it almost being 7, or where it is, how far it is away from being 8 o'clock. Or if it's 10 o'clock, okay, we have another 2 hours before it gets to midnight. We see it. We don't just understand it, we see it. And that seeing it gives us the ability to understand what 1 minute is, what 30 seconds is, what's 5 minutes, and so on. But when we see a digital clock, we only see the right now. And so, in our idea of being time blind, if we are constantly looking at digital representations of time, we don't see it in its greater impact on time and space. And so we lose something there. And there are ways that we can fix this. We can get ourselves an analog clock and only look at that. We can get ourselves what's known as time timers, where it's like a timer, it's like an egg timer that you would use in the kitchen. Only it's an analog clock with a red space. So we would set it for, 15 minutes. And the 15 minutes is highlighted in red. And as time goes down, the red gets smaller. And so we could train ourselves to start estimating the amount of time it takes us to do tasks if we start saying, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to answer all my emails. I'm assuming that it's going to take me 30 minutes to answer, 100 emails or 30 emails. You estimate, put a log. This is my estimate of how long it's going to take me to answer these emails. Now set the time timer or look at a clock. Look at how much time it actually takes, then put actual. Start tracking your time and doing things like that. Eventually, you're going to notice, if you're time blind, that the time you estimate gets closer to the actual time because you're getting better at it. You're better able to estimate and you're able to actually see how long it takes. So that's one way to overcome time blindness. There's other ways as well, but to start physically estimating the time it takes you to do something and to compare it to the actual, not just saying, okay, I'm going to create a schedule for myself for the day, and this is all the things that I want to get done, and I'm just going to get it done. But if you don't know how long it actually takes you to get those things done, well, you're always going to feel like I'm failing at something if you're not estimating properly.
Absolutely. Wow. That's so huge. And I might just be talking for me, but I think I'm talking for a lot of people in the audience. As somebody who helps clients with time management and more from the at least basic starting point of, okay, you're not going to be able to get everything done. You can't have 20 priorities in a day. So, some of the fundamentals of time optimization management, whatever words you want to use, and very much kind of in the Stephen Covey sense of first things first. And yes, you do your most important things when you have the most energy. And all of those things have worked for me. But I'm still 20 years an entrepreneur and I track my time, where I invest my time. I have a tool that I use to do that. And I track how much money I've made in that particular area, that project. So it helps me. But I still find myself misestimating how long it's going to take to do something. And when you then have 3 to 5 other things in the schedule based upon that timing, you say, whoa, everything just went. And then you reach the end of the day, like, oh gosh, I only got one thing done or no things done. So again, I've made that step that, okay, I'm at least going to make sure I get the most important things done first. And then certainly in things, for example, podcast interviews, I now have a sense of how long it takes to do an interview and the prep time. So again, through repetition, but I just look at for so many years, and I still struggle with this, is when I get multiple ideas and which do I implement first, and genuinely thinking that I'm going to implement all of them and then do that critical error of, oh gosh, instead of getting one of them implemented, I have three of them like halfway done, or a third done, or whatever it might be. And having done the planning, I'm a good boy. I ate my vegetables. I did what I thought I was supposed to do, and it's not working. And so I think that's something I'm going to be very interested to check out, the book you recommend, of understanding that more from the doctors, just to get a better sense of what is that blind spot I have, because I know I have that. And again, that would be that thing that for me, the sort of cycle of that is okay. So I'm time blind in my planning. Eventually I get frustrated doing planning. I say, okay, I'm just gonna get one thing done a day. But then I might get that one thing done and be not, and then have nothing else planned. And then the second half of the day, I'm kind of like, okay, what do I do? And so it's something for me at times. I've had these bursts of productivity and something awesome happens. And then a week later, I just feel off. And by default, I might go back to, okay, well, I need to do more vision work or planning. No, I know I could, if if I'm on my deathbed and half alive, I can recite my visions. I know my visions. I've done the vision work, or at least what I want to look like. But when you talk to me about the execution part of it, whew, there are times where it just doesn't match what I wanted. I know what I want it to look like. And the other part, going back to the lazy thing, I'm willing to do the work, but it can be very
Mm.
overwhelming until I learn the process. And then if you add that, this is, wow, this is a serious first world problem I've got here, Joy. And then you add to that that by the time I get this all figured out, then it becomes the work you're like, okay, I'm bored with this now. I know how this all works. So that part that's like, okay, I want a new challenge, and trying to manage all that in a way. And yet, one of the things I think you've done, which is something, if I would look at one of the things, one of the best things I've done or decisions I've made, which was really made for me by example, and I've learned from my parents, is that as best as I know how, family comes first. And it can look different. It can look a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to look the way mine does, or my vision, or your vision. But that being an anchor, that at least I have a litmus test to say, okay, what I'm doing is not helping in that way. And to be really clear, sometimes it means more time with family. Sometimes it does mean, hey, I didn't make enough money. I really wanted to go on a vacation. Oops, I've got all this time with my family, and I want to make some more money so we can go on a vacation, or whatever it might be. But at least having some sort of anchor for that. What would you say, as we start looking at this more, what would be the difference between a person who needs what you do, the work of a
Mm.
coach, versus just maybe exploring? What does it look like when you say, no, a person's just a little bit off, versus a person you say, wow, this might be the difference between them being able to be wildly successful in what they're doing versus perhaps risking failure, as far as their functioning, and what might that, okay, what does that client say to you when you say, wow, this is my sweet spot. This is the person that really needs my help. And they're doing these 10 other things right, but this one thing is really hurting them. What would that feel like, or what that person be thinking?
So, generally, the people that I work with who come to see me are the people who have very specific goals that they want to achieve, and they're just not having success in executing on their own, and want to explore. Yes, I can offer ideas that work for other clients, but really want to explore what's getting in their way and how they can hold themselves accountable better. It's identifying a goal, they have one, and they just want support and accountability in achieving that goal. Coaching is very goal directed, it's very future oriented, and what's wonderful about it is that there's the accountability piece in coming to the coach. And so, depending on who you are, the amount of accountability that you might need might be higher than others. Um, I know that people in the who have ADHD generally require more assistance with the accountability versus people without ADHD. But at one point, it's fun to do things with other people and it helps us commit better. Coaching, though, the major work is done in between sessions by the client who comes to see me. And these sessions are really brainstorming sessions, for lack of a better way of saying it, in ways to achieve the goal.
Awesome. Yeah, that's something I find with the clients I work with is very often, whether it's recruiting coaching, sales coaching, how to get to a 3-day weekend, 4-day work week, whatever it might be. Um, if I use the word accountability in my sales copy, I will sell more stuff. So first of all, most people realize as entrepreneurs, like, okay, I need more
Yes.
accountability. And then of course I try to think about, okay, am I actually going to help them do that? And even more importantly, as somebody offering a service, what does that look like and what does it take? Because as somebody who also, offers online courses, sometimes one of the worst things you can do is to give a client really great ideas, but no accountability structure. And you charge them, say, I'm just going to charge you for the ideas, but the ideas alone aren't going to do it. And so it's almost like it's almost like a car without wheels. Like, yeah, well, but the whole car without the wheels is worth 28,000, blah, 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 or 50,000, like a Maserati without the wheels. Yeah. But in terms of going from point A to point B, a Maserati without wheels is still worthless as far as the function.
Yes.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'll take a Maserati without the wheels and I'll figure out how to flip it or buy the wheels. But in that sense, I find a lot of people with the accountability part, they still come back to this laziness thing or this self thing. Well, oh no, or it feels almost, you hear some coach say, well, if you need an accountability coach, you're not committed enough, or I hear these different things. And I just think about how I started my podcast and I'd taken I'd taken 2 different courses over a 7-year period. There were online courses, did not start my podcast. And then finally and both of those 2 courses were by industry leaders, and they're good courses. Nothing wrong with the people who did it. And I still look to those courses and I learned from them. Then a friend of mine who's not an industry leader, really good and solid, knows what she does, did a course and offered 6 weeks of Zoom calls while we would implement them and go step by step. And for me, that's how I started my podcast. I could not, or maybe I could have, but it just didn't happen otherwise. And again, I've been an entrepreneur 20 years. I coach people on accountability, but we're sometimes blind with our own issues. But even it's just something that's so simple of like, okay, without that variable, that was in that case the critical variable of having some sort of as the 4 disciplines of execution book we call it, some sort of cadence of accountability, some sort of repetition of what I'm doing and place that yes, I'm going to come to a call, and it still technically took me maybe 8 weeks, but so I still kind of like, okay, it wasn't perfect, but without that, I would have still been looking at the online screen, looking at like, okay, what are you going to do for me? Looking at the computer screen as if it's going to do something, when a lot of it was about me and me doing that work. So, um, thank you so much. Gosh, there's so much, and as I told you at the beginning, I said I don't think we're going to even get to everything. We touched on a few different things. Um, and by the way, first of all, we'll always put the links, so your social media links and all that
Thank
stuff. We'll
you.
put that in here. So if you're listening, people can hear that. Um, what's the project that's your passion that you're working on now, and maybe talk a little bit about, just to let people know, this idea of cracking the parenting code. What does that look like, or how are you helping people with that?
So, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I'm a self professed ex helicopter parent. And um, when I went into parenting, I had this very clear idea of how I wanted to parent, and I wanted my children to have boundaries, and I wanted them to achieve success. And I had these ideas of what success looked like, and I wanted them to achieve well academically, and you name it. I had all of these ideas, and I wanted, just like I curated my career, I wanted to curate my children. And that doesn't really work in real time, in real life. And I was on this journey. And what I noticed is that I didn't like who I was becoming as a parent. Outwardly, my friends were generally amazed at how I would follow through. As parents, we threaten our children with certain punishments and we don't follow through because they're too. I was the parent who followed through. I was the parent who literally took my child out of a restaurant when they were having a meltdown, and I left the restaurant and I left my husband and my other child there. At a friend dinner because the behavior wasn't correct. So we leave. But I didn't like how I was feeling inside, and I really hated the amount of yelling I was doing with my children, and I started seeing things in them that I didn't like. And when I look in a mirror, I realize they were mirroring my behaviors because I was their role model. So was my husband. But I was seeing a lot of behaviors that I didn't like that I was doing to them. They were mirroring it back to me. And when my daughter was diagnosed with cancer, I started realizing that something had to change. But what was interesting for me is that the doctors would speak to me as though, or at least I felt this, that they were speaking to me as an equal. And I really appreciated that as a parent who I'm not a doctor, I don't know, but when I would offer ideas, they would take me seriously and have conversations. And so it started really from her treatments. And I guess I was lacking a bit of self confidence. And my daughter also always struggled in school. And I was having her tested and tested and tested for 50 million different things. And I would wait for the teachers and for the school administrators and for someone to tell me what to do. And it was when I started doing my own research and started looking into things that I started realizing, wow, I have power too. Then I started learning about executive functioning and started realizing, wow, it's not my son's fault that he's behaving the way he is. So why am I treating him like he's doing something wrong when it's really his brain that's causing him to do these things? Which led me to another course called Shanker's Self-Regulation. And I wanted to learn about self-regulation. What I didn't realize is that I was opening another can of worms. And it changed the way I was parenting my children. And it changed the way I saw their behavior. I no longer saw their behavior as misbehavior. I saw their behavior as stress behavior and as biological. And so when you reframe behavior, you come at parenting in a different way. And my parenting started changing. And I also started listening to Brene Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us. And I started listening to another podcast called The Happiness Lab by Dr. Laurie Santos. And yet another podcast by Lynn Lyons, who does Flusterclux. It's on anxiety. And I'm listening to all these podcasts by, like, Brene Brown's a social worker. Lynn Lyons specializes in anxiety. Dr. Stuart Shanker is a neuropsychologist, and Laurie Santos is a psychologist, but I don't remember what her specialty is, but she has now started examining the science behind happiness. And everything I was learning was all coming back to the same message, even though it was from people in different fields. And it affected how I was parenting my children. And so I don't have all the answers by a long shot, but my podcast is really my journey from becoming a helicopter parent to where I am now, which is very much, I would like to call myself a holistic parent. And I give my children what they need when they need it, but I'm not trying to curate their lives anymore. I'm not trying to have them achieve my definition of success anymore. I am trying to allow them to grow and learn the skills they need to achieve their own definitions of success. And so the podcast is really a reflection on my journey, and as well as all of the lessons I've learned that I'm sharing with other people, and a whole bunch of new questions that I'm asking myself and asking others to reflect on. So it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. And that's Being with Joy, a quest to crack the parenting code, correct?
Correct. I'm a parent like everybody
Awesome.
else.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your help today, Joy. There's so much you have in here. I encourage you all, if you want to learn more about Joy, You can reach out to her. And what's the best place as far as website wise for
Yeah,
people to
so
reach
my
you?
website, my new website for my coaching practice is still being built. So there's no one place. You could find me. I have a Facebook page, SETA, SETA, EF Skills. You could find me on LinkedIn, Joy Gandell. You could find me on Instagram, Joy Gandell as well, um, are the best ways to reach out to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And everybody, hope you get a lot from this. There's, gosh, so much to unwrap here, and not just the productivity part for you, how it relates to family, 3-day weekend, all that good stuff. So, as always, look forward to helping you create the life and the lifestyle you most desire so you can better enjoy your family, your friends, and the entire journey. Thanks so much for listening.